Tyler's voice came out of the courtroom speaker, sounding smaller than I remembered it, tinny and flattened by the recording, but every word landed exactly the same as it had the first time I heard it, standing in my own kitchen with a phone in my shirt pocket and a mug of coffee going cold in my hand. Doesn't even remember the doctor's name half the time, Mom. It won't even be a fight. We just need you to sign the petition. I watched my nephew's face while his own voice played back to him in front of a judge, his mother, and his attorney. It took him about 4 seconds to understand that the recording wasn't going to stop, and about 4 more to understand what it meant that I was the one who'd made it. For seconds. I'd had 11 months to prepare for that particular 4 seconds, and I intended to watch every part of it. Let me back up, because to understand how my nephew ended up sitting in a Wednesday morning competency, listening to himself plan to have his own uncle declared unfit, you need to understand something about the man he'd spent 2 years quietly underestimating. My name is Arthur. I'm 68 years old. And most days you'd find me exactly where you'd expect to find a retired engineer who never left the county he was born in. Out at the shop behind my house, 40 acres outside town, wearing a canvas jacket with a torn pocket I keep meaning to mend, driving a truck with 210,000 miles on it, because it still starts every morning and I see no reason to replace something that works. What almost nobody outside my late wife Ruth and my accountant knows is that I hold the patent on a pressure-regulating valve component that ended up, through a licensing deal I signed in 1994 for what felt at the time like a reasonable amount of money, inside roughly a third of the industrial irrigation systems installed in this country over the last 3 decades. I didn't get rich by building a company. I got rich by being the guy who solved one very specific, very boring engineering problem better than anyone else had, and then quietly collecting a small royalty on it, year after year, while I kept working my regular job at the co-op until I retired at 62. By the time Ruth passed 4 years ago, the royalties, the land, and 30 years of unglamorous investing had turned into a family trust worth just over $15 million. Money I never spent on anything you could point to. I still buy my jeans at the same feed store I've shopped at since 1985. I patched the truck instead of trading it in. Ruth used to tease me that I was the only millionaire in the state who reused sandwich bags, and she wasn't entirely joking. I set the trust up the way I did. Modest distributions to family, the bulk held for education, medical emergencies, and eventually charitable work Ruth cared about. For a simple reason. I'd watched, over the decades, what sudden money does to people who aren't ready for it, and I didn't want my family to become a case study. I wanted them to know me as their uncle first, and as a man with resources a distant second, if they ever needed to know it at all. Here's the complication nobody planned for, including me. My sister Denise has 1 son, my nephew Tyler, 34 years old, and for most of his life, I was simply Uncle Arthur, the one with the shop and the boring truck. I never tried to be more than that. I showed up to his little league games, taught him to weld one summer when he was 16 and bored, and never once made him feel like there was a version of me he hadn't met yet. It mostly worked. Mostly. They're the night I still think about, from about 6 years ago. That's the reason I never regretted keeping the trust quiet even when it later became inconvenient. Tyler had just gone through a rough divorce and was staying with Denise for a few weeks. He came by the shop one evening, upset, talking about how he felt like his whole life had been decided by other people's money, his ex-wife's family, his in-laws, everyone but him. I didn't tell him about the trust that night. I told him about the valve, about failing 11 prototypes before the 12th one worked, about how nobody handed me anything. They just eventually stopped being able to say no to something that functioned better than what they already had. He seemed to actually hear it. I've held on to that conversation for years as proof that the boy I taught to weld was still in there somewhere, underneath whatever came later. Ruth was the one who insisted, back when we first sat down with Harold to draft the trust, that we build in something she called a long fuse provisions that released money slowly, tied to milestones, rather than handing anyone a windfall the moment we were gone. She used to say that money given too fast to someone who hadn't built anything yet was less a gift than a test most people weren't ready to pass. I fought her a little on it at the time, thinking it sounded overly cautious for family. I understood what she meant about 4 years after she died, watching how differently my two great nieces on her side of the family, who'd grown up knowing the trust existed but never counting on it, talked about money compared to how Tyler, who'd only found out about its rough size a few years back, had started to. I don't say any of this to paint myself as some kind of saint who saw everything coming. I didn't. I like my nephew. I still do even now. I simply built my life deliberately so that liking someone and trusting them with $15 million could stay two separate questions, answered on two separate timelines. That distinction is the only reason any of what follows was survivable. I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about a nephew who was calculating from the start. For most of his 20s, Tyler's dismissiveness toward me was just ordinary. The mild, affectionate condescension a lot of young people have toward an uncle who still uses a flip phone and can't figure out how to attach a photo to an email. I never held that against him. It's the kind of thing you laugh off at Thanksgiving. What changed over the 2 years before all of this was something quieter and more specific. It wasn't affectionate condescension anymore. It was assessment. Tyler's second marriage had put him under real financial pressure. A mortgage he'd stretched for, a business venture with a former coworker that had eaten through most of his savings, and by his mid-30s, a growing sense, which he never said outright, but which showed up in 100 small comments, that his uncle's quiet, modest life represented an asset that was somehow being wasted by not being spent. It started small. At a family dinner about 2 years ago, he asked, half joking, whether I'd ever thought about actually enjoying the royalty money instead of sitting on it out at the shop. I told him I was enjoying it exactly the way I wanted to. He laughed and said, "Sure, Uncle Arthur," in a tone that made clear he thought I simply didn't understand what I had. By last spring, the comments had a different texture entirely. He started asking me questions that felt less like conversation and more like an inventory. How I was sleeping, whether I ever forgot appointments, whether I'd noticed myself repeating stories. I chalked the first few up to genuine concern. I am 68, and it isn't unreasonable for family to ask. But the questions kept coming, oddly specific, oddly frequent, and always followed up a day or two later by a call to Denise that I only heard about secondhand. Tyler mentioning to his mother that Uncle Arthur seemed a little off at dinner, or that he'd had to remind him twice about something I hadn't, in fact, needed reminding about at all. If you've ever had someone start narrating a version of you that doesn't match who you actually are, you know how disorienting it is. Not because you doubt yourself, but because you start to understand that the story is being built for an audience that isn't you. Around the same time, Tyler's second wife, Nicole, started asking me questions of her own at family gatherings, softer, friendlier on the surface, but pointed in a way I didn't fully register until much later. At Denise's birthday dinner last summer, she asked, apropos of nothing, whether I'd ever thought about simplifying things for the family while I was still able to make those decisions myself. At the time I took it as ordinary estate planning small talk, the kind every family has eventually. Looking back, I think it was closer to a soft opening, a way of testing whether I'd bring up the trust unprompted or whether the subject still made me cautious enough to change it. I changed it. I've wondered since whether that reaction told her something. There was one afternoon, about 4 months before everything came to a head, that I think of as the moment I understood what was actually happening. Tyler came by the shop unannounced and asked, almost too casually, whether I still remembered our family attorney's name. I did, of course. I'd worked with the man for 11 years. But something about the specific way Tyler asked it, watching my face a beat too long for the answer, told me he wasn't making conversation. He was checking a box on a list somebody else had given him. That was the night I bought a small digital voice recorder from the electronics counter of the hardware store, the same kind duck hunters used to log call patterns, and started keeping it in my shirt pocket most days. Our state only requires one party's consent to record a conversation, and I made sure of that before I did it. I told myself I was probably being paranoid. I kept it running anyway. The confirmation came on a Tuesday evening in October, when I stopped by Denise's house to drop off a chainsaw I'd fixed for her and heard my own name coming through the screen door before I'd even reached it. Tyler was on speakerphone with someone. I learned later it was an elder law attorney he'd been consulting for weeks, and Denise was sitting at the kitchen table, listening. He doesn't even remember the doctor's name half the time, Mom, Tyler was saying, his voice pitched with the particular confidence of someone who believes he's alone. It won't even be a fight. We just need you to sign the petition, and once there's a temporary guardianship in place, the trust review doesn't need his sign-off anymore. It just needs yours as co-trustee. That's the whole thing. I stood on the porch for a long moment before I knocked, recorder already running in my pocket, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something closer to a slow, sick recalculation, the same kind Tyler himself would go through months later, running back through 2 years of just checking on you phone calls and realizing that some unknown portion of them had never been concern at all. They'd been reconnaissance. I knocked. Tyler ended the call fast enough that his voice cracked doing it. I handed Denise her chainsaw, made small talk for 4 unbearable minutes, and drove home with my hands tighter on the wheel than they needed to be for a straight county road I'd driven 10,000 times. Over the next 6 weeks, I did 2 things. I called my actual attorney, not the elder law consultant Tyler had been quietly retaining, but Harold, the man who'd handled Ruth's estate and knew the trust better than anyone alive, and I asked him, calmly, what a formal guardianship petition against a mentally competent trust holder would actually require, and what would happen to it if the petitioner's own testimony didn't hold up. Harold, to his credit, didn't treat it as paranoia. He'd seen this particular pattern before, he told me, more often than most families would like to admit. A relative under financial strain, a slow campaign, a concern laid down months in advance, and a guardianship petition timed for exactly the moment it would look to an outside judge like reluctant necessity rather than what it actually was. And I kept the recorder running, not to entrap anyone further, but because I now understood I needed a complete record of exactly what was being said about me in rooms I wasn't supposed to be in. I want to be honest that it wasn't a comfortable 6 weeks. I sat through 2 more family dinners knowing what I knew, answering Tyler's increasingly specific, just checking on you questions with answers I'd started quietly to calibrate. Not lies, never lies, but a controlled kind of plainness, giving him nothing new to add to whatever file he thought he was building. Denise mentioned once, almost in passing, that Tyler had asked her to keep an eye on things when she saw me. I told her that sounded like a reasonable thing for a caring nephew to ask. I didn't tell her why my jaw was tight when I said it. It was time Tyler learned that the uncle he'd spent 2 years quietly building a case against had spent those same 2 years quietly building one of his own. The petition was filed in early December, an emergency guardianship request, citing concerning cognitive changes and 2 affidavits. One from Tyler and a shorter, visibly reluctant one from Denise, who I later learned had asked Tyler twice whether he was certain before agreeing to sign anything. Harold and I didn't fight the hearing date. We welcomed it. What Tyler expected, walking into that courtroom, was a quiet, mostly administrative Wednesday morning. A judge inclined to grant a temporary order out of caution, an uncle too confused or too passive to meaningfully object, and a fast path to co-trustee authority over $15 million he'd spent 2 years convincing himself was being wasted on a man too simple to appreciate it. What he got instead was Harold calmly requesting the court's permission to enter a series of audio recordings into the record, made by me, over a 5-week period, fully compliant with state consent law, documenting the actual planning behind the petition Tyler had just sworn to under oath. I watched my nephew's face while his own voice played through the courtroom speaker. The doctor's name comment that it won't even be a fight. The line about the trust review no longer needing my sign-off once a guardianship order was in place. It took him about 4 seconds to understand what was happening, and about 4 more to understand that his mother, sitting beside him, was hearing the actual plan for the first time, stripped of the concerned framing he'd given her at the kitchen table. The judge didn't need long after that. The petition was denied, on the record, with language I won't repeat here because Harold asked me not to gloat about it, and he was right to ask. What mattered more to me than the ruling itself happened afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, when Denise turned to her son and asked him, in a voice I'd never heard her use before, "Is that true? Is that actually what you told me at the table that night?" Tyler didn't answer her. He looked at me instead, and for the first time in 2 years, I watched him actually see me. Not the slow uncle with the flip phone, not the asset to be assessed and managed, just his uncle standing in a courthouse hallway, having spent 5 weeks quietly refusing to be managed at all. "You recorded me," he said, and it wasn't quite an accusation. It was closer to disbelief. "I recorded myself protecting 15 years of my wife's wishes for this family," I said. "You made that necessary the day you decided my memory was a legal strategy instead of just my memory." I didn't pursue anything further against Tyler. Harold offered to explore it. There were arguments to be made about the affidavit, about intent, but I told him no. Punishing my nephew into the ground wasn't going to repair anything, and repair, if it was possible at all, was the only outcome I actually wanted. What I did instead was sit down with Harold and formalize something I'd been meaning to do for years anyway. A family governance provision added to the trust, requiring any future guardianship or competency concern to go through an independent geriatric evaluation by a court-appointed physician before any legal petition could even be filed by a family member. Not because I thought I'd need it again, because if a concern is ever real, it deserves a process that doesn't depend on who's most convincing at a kitchen table. Tyler and I didn't speak for almost 4 months. Denise called often, mostly to apologize, though I told her every time that she wasn't the one who owed the apology. When Tyler finally did reach out, it wasn't with an excuse. He asked if he could come by the shop, and when he did, he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he said the only thing that actually mattered, that somewhere in the last 2 years he'd stopped being able to see me as a person and started seeing me as a problem to be solved, and that hearing his own voice do that, played back in a courtroom, was the worst thing he'd ever heard about himself. I didn't forgive him that afternoon. I told him that trust, unlike money, doesn't come with a recorded balance you can check. It has to be rebuilt one honest year at a time, and I wasn't in a hurry. He's been out to the shop most weekends since, and about 2 months ago, without my asking, he spent an entire Saturday helping me finally replace that torn jacket pocket zipper, badly, with visible stitching I have no intention of fixing, because I kind of like looking at it. Denise and I are closer now than we've been in years, oddly enough. She told me once, sitting on my porch, that she'd always sensed something was different about how Tyler talked about me those last 2 years, and that she'd talk herself out of asking harder questions because she didn't want to believe what the answer might be. We didn't need to say much more than that. Some understandings don't require a long conversation once they finally arrive. As for the recorder, I still keep it in the truck's glove compartment, batteries fresh, not because I expect to need it again, but because it taught me something I don't want to forget, that being underestimated is a kind of quiet, and quiet, it turns out, is something you can use. Here's what 15 years of holding a family's money quietly has taught me. The people who are planning to take something from you rarely announce it directly. They build the case first, in small comments, in casual concern, in questions that sound like love, but function like an inventory. The only real defense is paying close enough attention to notice the difference between someone who's checking on you and someone who's checking a box. Tyler didn't try to take my trust because he thought I was a bad man. He tried to take it because he'd convinced himself I was a slow one. And it turned out that was the one thing about me he'd never bothered to actually test. If someone's ever quietly built a case against you while calling a concern, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there are a lot more quiet uncles, quiet trusts, and overdue reckonings still to come. I'll see you in the next one.